The United States is caught up in a partisan war, pulling apart politicians, communities, even families. Differences that have been simmering for years are stoking America's famous melting pot, and it now looks set to boil over. In this Inside the Americas, a country divided. I'm Jeannie Godula. In this year's U.S. presidential campaign, it's no longer just Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, Republican versus Democrat. It's urban versus rural, black versus white, rich versus poor, mask versus no mask. The line between liberals on the left and conservatives on the right has never been so clear.
Only 3 to 4% of American voters say they're still undecided 1 month before the election, showing just how polarized the 2020 presidential race has become. The portion of voters who identify as independent has dropped from 37 to 34% in the past 4 years, with Americans increasingly declaring themselves either Democrats or Republicans. One huge factor, Donald Trump. 94% of Republicans approve of his performance, as opposed to only 7% of Democrats. While opinions of Barack Obama were also starkly divided before his re-election, Bill Clinton saw some 20% approval among Republicans, while George W. Bush garnered around 15% approval on the Democratic side. The current separation is clear. No matter who they support, 40% of voters say they have no friends on the other side. It's an extreme divide that finds its roots in the Republican Party's increasing alignment with the most conservative fringe of the electorate. According to a 2019 study, only 36% of Republicans support abortion rights, down from 39% in 2007. Meanwhile, Democrats have increased their support for abortion rights from 63% to 82%, proof that their demographic has shifted to the left. A phenomenon due in part to Bernie Sanders' popular primary campaigns. This November 3rd, two radically different visions of the U.S. are facing off for the future of the country.
Sherry Berman is a political scientist at Columbia University in New York. She joins me now from there. Sherry, I'm simplifying a bit, but to better explain it to our international viewers, the biggest difference politically seems to come down to values. Republicans see the true national identity of America as a traditional one from another era when America was mostly white, mostly Christian. The Democrats see the U.S. as more secular, more progressive, more diverse. Now, it's been that way for decades. Why are things so much worse today?
Well, one major reason is that Americans have actually become more divided. It's not just that they've sorted themselves into political parties based, as you said, on different values, conservative, religious, as opposed to more secular and diverse, but also because they've separated their lives to perhaps a greater extent than at any time in the recent past. There's a greater division geographically, with Democratic voters clustered in urban regions on the coast, and Republican voters clustered in more rural regions and ex-urban areas. They're also more different as far as the people that they interact with on a daily basis. There's less interaction in kinds of civil society activities, in neighborhood activities and things like that. People are going to different churches, or some going to churches and not at all. And so part of the issue is that Republicans and Democrats simply interact less than they might have in the past. And in that kind of situation, it's much more easy to see someone as an other, as very different from you, and therefore more potentially threatening.
You mentioned this notion of what's been defined by one journalist as the big sort, where Americans sort of self-select themselves into bubbles, choosing either a town or a neighborhood or a church that fits for them. A lot of people might argue that that's actually normal. Why not be around people who are like you? It's comfortable. What's the problem?
Well, of course it's comfortable, and to some degree, therefore, kind of inevitable. But as I mentioned before, the problem is when you never see someone who's different from you, it's much easier to be fearful of them. It's much easier to demonize them. And so, yes, this has always existed, and particularly in the past, it has existed along racial lines even more than socioeconomic lines. But now that partisanship or party identity has become so central, right, in a way it was not a generation ago, the fact that that political identity has also lined up to a large degree with racial identity, geographic identity, socioeconomic condition, really means that, again, it's much easier to see someone from the other party as dramatically different from you. And it's therefore easier, as I mentioned, for politicians to kind of whip up this fear that they're not just different, but threatening.
Sherry, stay with me. We're actually going to take a look now at a very concrete example of two American neighbors who are in the swing state of Pennsylvania. They are separated by one thin wall, but they also live on complete opposite sides of the political fence. Here's more from our team in Philadelphia.
Campaign signs sprung up across the lawns of suburban Philadelphia. Living on one side of this semi-detached house, Democrats Matt and Judy Sanders. On the other, Katie Wizard, a Republican.
Judy? Yes.
Okay.
And Matthew.
Matt and Judy Sanders are pro-Biden, while their neighbor Katie holds different political views.
Single building, two homes.
Two views. Like, you ever seen the Grand Canyon? It would be about that size of a gap, at least for me.
Across the lawn, Katie Wizard will be voting for Donald Trump.
Okay. Yeah, so that sign or on her side.
The most heated subject the two neighbors have discussed, the demonstrations in support of the Black Lives Matter movement.
They are anarchists. They want to tear America apart. They would come and take my house and give it to an African American or a black person.
Okay. I follow you.
Katie Wizard gets her information from Fox News, the channel which supports Donald Trump.
It's just like...
While on the other side of the wall, the Sanders watch CNN.
New Dodge Ram Protester Edition.
I feel Fox News takes information and chews it up and then spits it into willing people's mouths.
Anything. Trump's base laps it up and believes it in their core.
COVID, protests on social media, spats between neighbors have reached new heights.
And that's the guy who calls everybody, we should be wearing swastika stickers. Yeah, the one right here.
What did you say?
That all Trump supporters should be wearing swastika stickers.
The Republican neighbors say Joe Biden is trying to bring Soviet-style socialism to the United States.
Department and the fire department are socialist. Our trash pickup, it's all socialist.
The infrastructure for the roads.
Services from the government. That's socialism.
This set of neighbors has already had all the difficult conversations. But on a day-to-day basis, they manage to get on well with one condition.
We avoid politics like the plague. Yes.
Totally. You don't
We try. No, I'm sorry.
Sports about who's going to cut the grass next.
This small patch of suburbia is an example of the wider mood in the United States.
Sherry Berman, let me bring you back in here. How big a part has the media played in these increased divisions across the states? We saw in that report the Republican neighbor watching Fox News, the Democrats watching CNN. Are those channels to blame in part for this political divide?
So that's a great question we didn't talk about before, and these neighbors really bring up, which is there is a growing divide among partisans, members of the Democratic or partisans of the Democratic and Republican parties, on where they get their information. And Fox News and conservative talk radio are an incredibly powerful force in the United States. They reach large numbers of people, and they really are the main source of information for Republicans. The fact that the Democratic family listened to CNN is indicative, but it's also the case that Democratic voters tend to have somewhat more varied sources of information. But Fox News and conservative talk radio are so dominant on the right. And what the discussion you just had between these two families reveals is that they're getting very different information, very different perspectives on exactly the same issues. Like, for example, the Black Lives Matters protests. One see them as, peaceful protests for racial justice. The others see them as bringing anarchy and chaos to the United States. Same events, completely, totally different views and spins on them.
What about the risk of violence? Political protests have already been very tense this year in places like Oregon. Let's say the election's a close one or declared illegitimate, or someone refuses to concede. People start protesting and it spins out of control. Do you think this election could spark a wave of violence in the states?
Well, I certainly hope not. We've seen more violence than I'd like to see already. I mean, when there's lots of people who are on edge and lots of people out on the street, the potential for some kind of mistake obviously grows dramatically. The talk of sort of sending people to the polls who are not official poll watchers, who have not been trained, that is very, very dangerous because, again, election day is a time when there are lots of people around. The stakes are really quite high. So I hope that that doesn't happen because, again, the potential for mistakes, especially in a country where so many people have access to firearms, is really quite great. A lot obviously depends on what the authorities do. A lot depends on what the president does, what he tells his supporters, the kinds of behavior he encourages. So I hope this will not happen. But, again, the tensions are high. People are out on the streets. The pandemic has made people, more than a little crazy everywhere. And so that could potentially be an explosive mix.
So what's the answer? Or is it even possible to find an answer at this point? Can America breach this massive divide?
Of course it can. I mean, we have in our past. We, of course, have had a civil war. That was a long time ago, but we also lived through the 60s as people in Europe did. This was also a time of great division and even of violence and, of course, massive street protests. A lot depends on who wins the election and what that person does. If after the election, hopefully a clear one without violence, the incoming president is very clear about the need to heal these divides, about the need to recognize that we have significant differences, but that these are differences that we can and must deal with, and who tries to tamp down the sense again that, we are at a precipice and that we can't come together as Americans to deal with many of the difficult issues that we really have to deal with.
Sherry, thank you so much for speaking to us today. Sherry Berman there talking about that great American divide. That wraps it up for this Inside the Americas. Next time, everything you ever wanted to know about just how American elections work. We'll be answering your questions about that very complicated process. So send me a tweet at Jeannie Godula. We'll see you soon.
Special events.
It's one of those events you cannot ignore. Every 4 years, all eyes are on the White House. Donald Trump or Joe Biden? Who will America pick as its next president? Will the Republican incumbent stay in office, or will his Democratic rival unseat him? Throughout the campaign, our correspondents and guests will discuss the issues at the heart of the election.
Follow election results in our special edition beginning on the 3rd of November on France 24.